The Persian Gulf narrows at the Strait of Hormuz to a corridor 33 kilometers wide at its tightest point, and at that width, every ship that passes through it is, for a measurable number of minutes, within range of weapons positioned on both shorelines simultaneously. The U.S. Qeshm Navy has been threading that corridor for decades. The crews that do it understand the geometry without being told. The Iranian coastal defense network on the northern shore, the geography that compresses the navigable channel into a lane defined not by international law but by the depth contours that keep a laden tanker off the shoals, and the specific unambiguous vulnerability of a surface combatant that is constrained in its maneuvering options by the requirement to stay close to the vessel it is protecting. Escort operations in the strait are not like open ocean operations. There is no room to run. There is only the lane, the ship alongside you, and whatever is coming from the shore. USS Mason had been assigned to the escort of the MV Esperanza Star for 16 hours. When the first anomaly appeared on the electronic warfare display at 1:47 a.m., the Esperanza Star was a Panamanian-flagged crude carrier with a deadweight tonnage that made her one of the largest vessels currently transiting the strait. A vessel whose cargo, if delivered, would represent a significant quantity of Gulf crude reaching markets that the Iranian government had been attempting to pressure through a sustained campaign of maritime harassment that had been escalating in both frequency and technical sophistication over the preceding 4 months. The harassment had begun with warning transmissions and close approach maneuvers by Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, Navy fast boats. It had progressed through the mining of 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman, the seizure of 1 flagged vessel in disputed circumstances, and most recently the first operational deployment of what intelligence analysts had designated as the Shahed-derived maritime strike variant, a one-way attack drone adapted from the same airframe that had been used extensively in the land campaign in Yemen. Modified for overwater navigation and equipped with a shaped charge warhead sufficient to penetrate the hull plating of a commercial tanker or cause significant topside damage to a warship. The anomaly on the electronic warfare display was an emission pattern, not a radar, not a communication, a low-power datalink signal, frequency hopping in a pattern that the EW library had flagged with a 73% confidence match to the control architecture used by the Shahed maritime variant in its pre-launch coordination phase. The EW supervisor had been watching the Gulf's electromagnetic environment for 11 consecutive hours. He was tired in the specific way that sustained electronic surveillance produces. Not physically exhausted, but cognitively compressed. His pattern recognition running on reserves. He called the contact anyway. 3 seconds after he identified it, he called it because 73% in the strait at 1:47 a.m. is not a threshold for hesitation. The tactical action officer received the call and elevated the watch posture before the EW supervisor had finished his report. Active sensors came up to full scan. The SPY-1D began painting the surface picture in every direction. What it found, in the 31 seconds between the EW alert and the completion of the first full radar scan, was not 1 contact. It was 11. 11 low, slow, surface skimming contacts arranged in a dispersed formation bearing northwest of the Mason's current position, at ranges between 4 and 9 kilometers, closing at speeds consistent with maritime drone propulsion systems. The formation was not random. The spacing between contacts was deliberate. Wide enough that a single weapon engagement could not address multiple targets simultaneously. Close enough that the combined approach would arrive within the Mason's defensive perimeter in overlapping time windows that would force the combat system to sequence engagements faster than its standard fire control cycle was optimized to run. 11 drones, 1 ship, 1 tanker alongside that could not maneuver independently without running aground in the constrained channel. The TAO committed the 57mm deck gun to the nearest contact at 1:48 a.m. and simultaneously tasked the Mk-15 Phalanx system on the port sponson to begin tracking the contact cluster. The 57mm began firing at a range of 3 kilometers. The flat crack of each round audible across the water in the pre-dawn stillness. The first drone absorbed 3 rounds and continued on course. The airframe was small enough and the approach angle steep enough that the round impacts disrupted its structural integrity without immediately causing a flight termination. The 4th round struck the warhead section. The detonation produced a fireball visible from the bridge of the Esperanza Star 200 meters to port, a brief orange flare against the black water that the watch officer on the tanker's bridge would later describe as looking, from a distance, almost like a flare. The second drone reached the Phalanx engagement envelope at 1:48:40 a.m. The CIWS acquired, tracked, and destroyed it at a range of 900 meters. The 3rd and 4th drones were engaged simultaneously by the Phalanx and the 57mm in a firing sequence that lasted 11 seconds and consumed a quantity of ammunition that the gunnery officer noted on his status board with the particular attention that a sailor gives to numbers that are decreasing faster than anticipated. The 5th, 6th, and 7th drones arrived at the defensive perimeter within 4 seconds of each other. The Phalanx can engage 1 target at a time. The 57mm can engage 1 target at a time. 2 weapon systems, 3 simultaneous targets, 4 seconds. The engagement sequencing software made the priority assignments in 0.4 seconds. The Phalanx took the 5th drone at 700 meters. The 57mm engaged the 6th at 1,200 meters with a burst that caused a flight deviation but not a kill. The drone altered course 30 degrees to the left, narrowing its approach angle and reducing the remaining engagement window. The 7th drone had no weapon assigned to it for a window of 2.3 seconds. In those 2.3 seconds, the 7th drone closed from 800 meters to 500 meters on the Mason's starboard quarter. The CIWS completed its engagement of the 5th drone, reacquired the deflected 6th drone, and simultaneously received the handoff track for the 7th. It could only address one. It chose the 7th, the closer, the more immediate, the one whose time to impact had dropped below the engagement threshold for any other option. The 6th drone, its approach path altered by the 57mm burst, was now tracking on a vector that would take it across the Mason's bow at a range of approximately 200 meters. Close enough to cause potential damage from the warhead detonation, far enough that the detonation geometry would be unfavorable for hull penetration. The CIWS fired on the 7th drone at a range of 380 meters. The drone detonated. The pressure wave reached the Mason's starboard hull plating as a sharp physical shock. Not catastrophic, not a penetration, but a load that was felt through the deck plates by every person aboard as a concussive reminder that the margin between a managed engagement and a catastrophic one is measured in meters and fractions of seconds. The 6th drone detonated at 1:49:17 a.m., 190 meters off the Mason's port bow, close enough that the fragmentation pattern from its warhead section raked across the forward weather deck and struck the base of the forward communications mast with sufficient energy to sever the primary satellite communication antenna feed cable and put 3 non-penetrating fragment impacts into the forward hull plating above the waterline. Drones 8, 9, 10, and 11 were engaged and neutralized over the following 90 seconds by a combination of the Phalanx, the 57mm, and a decoy countermeasure deployment that altered the radar cross-section profile of the ship sufficiently to cause the onboard guidance systems of 2 of the drones to lose target lock and impact the water short of the hull. At 1:51 a.m., the drone engagement was over. At 1:51:09 a.m., the electronic warfare display lit up with a new emission signature. Not a datalink, a fire control radar. Specifically, the active seeker radar of a C-802 anti-ship missile, already in its terminal guidance phase, already inside the horizon, already 32 seconds from the hull. The C-802 had been launched from a mobile coastal battery positioned in the mountainous terrain of the Qeshm Island coastal zone, while the Mason's sensors and crew were fully committed to the drone engagement. The launch had occurred during the 60-second window when the Mason's electronic warfare suite had been operating in a degraded mode, a mode triggered by the proximity detonation of the sixth drone's warhead, which had generated an electromagnetic pulse sufficient to cause a momentary saturation of 3 of the EW system's receiving channels. The Iranian coastal battery commander had been watching the drone engagement on a passive radar feed. He had identified the EW degradation window. He had fired within it. 32 seconds. The Phalanx was already reloading from the drone engagement. The 57mm had expended 60% of its ready service magazine. The standard missile battery had not been committed during the drone phase. SM-2 missiles are not optimized for slow, low-flying drone targets, and the TAO had held them for exactly this contingency. He fired one SM-2 at the C-802 track at 1:51:11 a.m., 2 seconds after acquisition. The SM-2 was in the air before the crew and the CIC had fully processed what they were looking at. The SM-2 missed. The C-802's terminal seeker had executed a last-second altitude depression maneuver, dropping from its approach altitude of 5 meters above the sea surface to 2 meters in the final 4 seconds of flight. And the SM-2's intercept solution, computed for a 5-meter target, passed through empty air 1.2 meters above the missile's actual flight path. 22 seconds. The Phalanx completed its reload cycle at 1:51:21 a.m., 18 seconds from impact. The system acquired the C-802 immediately and began firing at a range of 1,400 meters. The 20mm rounds impacted the missile's airframe in a sustained burst that progressively degraded the aerodynamic stability of the weapon, causing it to pitch upward from its 2-meter flight profile in the terminal 3 seconds of its approach. The C-802 did not detonate against the hull. It struck the waterline at the junction of the hull and the keel sonar dome fairing, a section of the ship's underwater body that is not part of the main structural frame but is attached to it, and the warhead detonated on contact. The detonation occurred at 1:51:32 a.m., 41 seconds after the missile's fire control radar had first appeared on the EW display. The sonar dome fairing absorbed the initial blast and failed catastrophically, the fiberglass and acoustic damping material fragmenting outward and downward into the water. The blast energy that was not absorbed by the fairing propagated into the hull at the attachment point, a structural connection designed to carry the weight of the sonar dome during normal operations, not to absorb the overpressure of a warhead detonation at contact range. The attachment frames on the port forward section of the keel deformed. 2 frames cracked. The hull plating in the immediate vicinity of the attachment point developed a fracture along a weld seam that ran diagonally across 3 hull plates, creating an opening to the sea that the damage assessment team reaching the space 11 minutes later would measure at 63 centimeters across its widest dimension. The flooding began instantly. The sonar equipment room, a below-waterline space located directly above the dome attachment point, housing the processing equipment for the hull-mounted sonar array, began taking water at a rate that the automatic flood detection system measured and reported in the same second that the blast concussion knocked the watchstander in the adjacent passageway off his feet and into the outboard bulkhead. The watchstander was back on his feet in 4 seconds. He was moving toward DC Central before his situational awareness had fully reconstructed itself, operating on the trained reflex that converts a ship's kinetic event into a specific response sequence before the conscious mind has finished processing the inputs. He was the 3rd person to arrive at DC Central. The damage control officer was already there. The flooding rate on the sonar equipment room display was reading 400 liters per minute and climbing. 400 liters per minute in a below-waterline electronic space is a compounding problem. The sonar processing equipment occupied the upper half of the space on rack-mounted chassis. The flooding was entering from below, from the cracked hull plating and the failed dome attachment point. And it was rising. The equipment had emergency waterproofing on its lower panels, a design feature added during the Mason's last service life extension maintenance period that had been the subject of budget debate for 2 years before being approved. That waterproofing was buying time. Not much time. The flooding rate was still climbing as the hydrostatic pressure at the fracture geometry equalized with the sea pressure outside the hull, and the equipment that was currently above the water level would not remain so. The DC team designated for the forward lower spaces reached the access hatch to the sonar equipment room at 1:53 a.m. The hatch was a standard watertight door, and the compartment on the other side of it now had water at knee depth and rising. The lead petty officer made the first assessment. The fracture was in the hull plating of the space below the current waterline, accessible only from inside the flooding compartment. Controlling the flooding required getting into the space, locating the fracture, and applying a temporary patch from the interior. Wooden plugs and hydraulic bladder backing for a diagonal fracture of that dimension, in water that was currently at 60 centimeters depth and rising at a rate that would reach standing height in under 4 minutes. He went in. The water temperature in the Persian Gulf at 1:53 a.m. is not the shock of cold water that a sailor in northern latitudes might experience. It is warm, uncomfortably, disoriently warm for an enclosed flooding space, because the thermal differential that normally provides a clear sensory signal of immersion is absent. The petty officer moved through knee-deep, then thigh-deep water toward the hull plating at the aft end of the space, his battle lantern casting a moving cone of light across rack-mounted equipment, whose indicator lights were still active, still processing, still running on power supplied by the ship's electrical systems because the circuit breakers for that space had not yet tripped. He found the fracture by feel as much as by sight, running his hand along the hull plating until the suction of the inflow pulled at his palm, and the ragged edge of the cracked weld seam caught his fingers, 63 centimeters. Diagonal. The lower end of the fracture was fully submerged. The wooden plug kit carried by his assistant would address the upper portion. The hydraulic bladder from the DC locker would need to cover the lower section, set against the hull plating from the interior, and inflated to counter the hydrostatic pressure outside. He called the dimensions back to his assistant through the hatch in the flat, measured voice that is either a natural disposition or the product of enough training evolutions in flooding simulators to have normalized the experience of being in a space that is trying to fill with water. The bladder deployment in a diagonal fracture below the waterline requires positioning the bladder against the hull from inside the flooding space, holding it in position against the inflow pressure while the inflation circuit is connected, and initiating the inflation sequence without releasing the positioning pressure before the bladder has developed sufficient internal pressure to remain in contact with the hull under its own resistance. This is a two-person task, one to hold, one to connect and inflate. In a space that now had water at chest height and was still rising with battle lanterns as the only light source and the background noise of the flooding inflow making verbal communication difficult, those two people were a petty officer with 11 years of damage control experience and a damage controlman fireman who had reported aboard the Mason 49 days earlier. The fireman held the bladder. He held it against the hull at the lower end of the fracture, both arms extended into the current of the inflow, the suction pulling the bladder toward the fracture while he maintained the positioning pressure that would allow the inflation to seal correctly. The water was at his chin. He did not move. He did not shift his grip. He held the position for the 73 seconds it took the petty officer to connect the inflation circuit, purge the air from the line, and bring the bladder pressure up to the point where the inflow resistance dropped from a continuous surge to a seep. 73 seconds with water at his chin and his arms extended into the inflow of a cracked hull in the Persian Gulf at 1:56 a.m. 49 days into his first deployment. The flooding rate dropped from 400 liters per minute to 38 at 1:57 a.m. The automatic flood detection system updated its reading on the DC central display. The damage control officer, watching the number fall, said nothing. He logged the time and moved to the next line on his status board. Above the flooding space in the CIC, the situation had not become simpler. The forward satellite communication antenna feed cable severed by the sixth drone's fragment impact had taken 3 of the Mason's 7 primary communication circuits offline. The ship was operating on backup circuits that carried reduced bandwidth, and the coordination with the fleet commander, who was monitoring the engagement from a command platform 200 miles to the south and needed to make decisions about whether to dispatch additional assets to the Mason's position, was running through a relay that added latency to every exchange. The intelligence officer was working a secondary problem simultaneously. The C-802 launch from Qeshm Island had come from a mobile battery, and mobile batteries move. The battery that had fired was not going to remain in the position from which it had engaged. Locating it for a response required correlation of radar data, signals intelligence, and the kind of inference about adversary behavior that the analytical process produces slowly and combat operations require immediately. The P-8 Poseidon assigned to the Strait surveillance track was already repositioning toward the Qeshm Island coast at 2:01 a.m. Its sensors sweeping the coastal terrain for the thermal signature of a mobile launcher vehicle that had fired recently enough that its exhaust system would still be distinguishable from the ambient temperature of the surrounding rock. The P-8 crew found the contact at 2:09 a.m., a vehicle moving north along a coastal road, its thermal signature elevated above background in the precise pattern of a missile transporter erector launcher that had recently completed a firing cycle. The contact report went to the strike coordination cell. The response decision was made at a level above the Mason's commanding officer and executed within 6 minutes by assets that were not the Mason's assets and that operated under authorities the Mason's crew had no visibility into. The mobile battery was rendered inoperable at 2:15 a.m. The Mason held her escort position alongside the Esperanza Star through the remainder of the Strait transit. The tanker completed its passage and entered the Gulf of Oman at 3:44 a.m. The Mason remained on station, her sonar equipment room with the flooding contained in the bladder seal holding, her forward communications antenna operating on backup feed, her 57mm magazine at 41% of capacity, her Phalanx system fully reloaded and tracking, and her crew continuing to work the damage assessment that would take another 4 hours to complete. At 5:20 a.m., a relief escort arrived from the Gulf of Oman. The Mason was released from the escort commitment and began transit to Bahrain for emergency repairs. The crew shifted from general quarters to a reduced watch state. The flooding detail was still in the sonar equipment room, monitoring the bladder seal and managing the submersible pump that was keeping the residual water level below the equipment rack bases. Here are the numbers when the Strait falls behind the ship. 11 maritime drones in the coordinated first wave. 41 seconds from C-802 radar detection to warhead detonation. 63 centimeters, the width of the hull fracture at its widest point. 400 liters per minute, peak flooding rate in the sonar equipment room. 73 seconds, the time a damage controlman fireman held a bladder seal against an active hull inflow with water at his chin. 49 days into his first deployment. 3 communication circuits lost to fragment damage. 1 mobile coastal battery located and rendered inoperable at 2:15 a.m. 0 fatal outcomes among the crew of the Mason. 0 fatal outcomes aboard the Esperanza Star. The tanker delivered its cargo. The Iranian coastal battery commander had chosen his moment with precision. He had identified the sensor degradation window. He had fired into it. He had come within the geometry of a 2-meter altitude difference and 1.2 meters of intercept miss from placing a warhead into the hull of a U.S. Navy destroyer in a restricted waterway with no room to maneuver. He had understood correctly that the drone swarm was the preparation and the missile was the weapon. His doctrine was sound. His intelligence was accurate. His timing was nearly perfect. What he had not modeled was a fireman 49 days into his first deployment, standing chest-deep in floodwater with his arms extended into a hull inflow for 73 seconds because someone had trained him to do exactly that. And he had decided in the moment when the decision was entirely his that he would not be the one who let the seal fail. The Strait remembers every ship that has tried to close it. It has not closed yet.